Welcome back to the second ever Fantasy Football to the Max. I am your host, Randy Isbell, and as always, my co-host, Mike Mitchell. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to getting into the nitty-gritty parts of the draft now where we get to agree and disagree on stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually did a 14-team league draft yesterday. It did not go exactly the way I had planned. We discussed it off air last night and had a little bit of fun with it. But we'll get to all that and everything else. Today we break down quarterbacks, and we're also going to break down defenses and kickers, because what we want to do is get all of this information in these next two podcasts, tonight's podcast and Thursday's podcast. So if you have drafts coming up in the near future, all of this stuff will be out there for you at your disposal over the next few weeks. And then over the next few weeks before the season starts, we'll just kind of break things down even further. But we wanted to kind of get this introduction out to you because there's a lot of information out there. And, you know, W2M has a bunch of information, a bunch of podcasts going, and Sean Garmer, you know, the big brain behind all of this, has been working really hard to get all that information in one place. And you know, we're working on a website for you guys, so it's all in one place. And Mike, you and your company have been helping with that.
Yeah, we want to give a big thanks out to Epic Design Labs for helping us with our web design and marketing for the upcoming W2M Network website, which we will be launching on September 1st. So be sure to check out epicdesignlabs.com and be ready for that W2M Network website to be coming up in the next week and a half or so.
Yeah, it's been really exciting talking with Sean and everybody about getting things going. Also a little nerve-wracking because there is a lot of work involved, but Sean or Mike and his crew have definitely been helping out with that. But let's get into it right now because we have a lot to get to. Quarterbacks, Mike, the cornerstone of an offense. How early are you reaching for one of these guys?
Well, I know I bring up the term value frequently as we talk about different ways in which you draft your team. So for me, I'm going to look at it as, does a guy like a Cam Newton or an Aaron Rodgers is he still on the board in round 3? You know, somehow maybe round 4? If that's the case, I think there's enough value to certainly give a strong consideration to taking one of those premium quarterbacks, you know, a little bit earlier in the draft. If I had my preference, I probably wouldn't take any of my top 3 quarterbacks just because I think there's probably going to be value elsewhere. But I look at a situation where you never know how your draft's going to go, and if one of those guys is still sitting there at the top, the argument for taking him early is obviously you had your quarterback position sewed up. You don't have to worry about who you're going to start. You don't have to worry about matchups. If you've got Cam Newton or Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson, those guys are going to be your starters every week, and you don't have to be concerned with flip-flopping and checking the matchups as much. That's the plus side. The downside is, who are you passing on in those early rounds in order to take one of those quarterbacks? Because there should still be, you know, lots of running backs, lots of wide receivers available to you that you can consider taking instead of a quarterback in that situation. So again, it comes down to kind of how the draft flow is going and whether or not you can get one of those guys at kind of a steal rate in maybe a 3rd or 4th or, you know, possibly 5th round.
Yeah, definitely. Draft flow is a key component to all of this. And that's why, to me, I almost just go into any draft this year knowing I'm not going to get one of the top quarterbacks because people are going to reach for them far earlier than I want to. My first 3 picks, if not 4 picks, are almost guaranteed to be running backs and wide receivers before I think of anything else, unless, you know, a Gronkowski ends up to me at the end of the first round and I decide to take a flyer and try something different there. But as far as quarterbacks go, I more am inclined to go with taking 2 quarterbacks in like the 10th, 11th round back to back and just playing the matchups over a Cam Newton. I don't think the value decreases as much as other positions from the top guy to like the 15th guy as it does in quarterbacks with the way the league has really went into a passing way. I mean, do you agree or disagree?
I agree if you're able to play the matchups well enough. And some of this, if you're going to wait on a quarterback, it might be a good idea to actually schedules and maybe narrow it down to 3 or 4 guys that you think are going to be able to be productive on alternate weeks. For example, you have a Tyrod Taylor playing against Cleveland one week, and you have Phillip Rivers playing against Miami the next week. That might be a good alternating cast of quarterbacks. So some of it could be narrowed down to scheduling, and I know that's a little bit in depth if you're a newer player. But for those of us that are serious, we look into things like that to give ourselves a little bit better insight as to deciding between a group of quarterbacks who are all kind of lumped into the same category as far as productive capability.
Yeah, and that's also a big point you bring up. Taking a quarterback early takes out that extra work that you're going to have to do as far as looking up matchups or whatever, because you're just going to start them. Whether they're playing a tough defense or a weak defense, that they're your guy and you're going to go with it. But now you're going to have to take that research that you would be doing on the quarterback and putting it elsewhere because you're going to be weaker at another position. And that's kind of where I lean with quarterbacks is I would rather go out and get a top wide receiver and a top running back and do the matchup work on a quarterback than I would any other way, because I know no matter what, they're touching the ball on every offensive play. Therefore, when I do the research and know that this team is rough against the pass or they struggle against the pass, I know my guy is going to contribute. When doing matchup work for, say, a wide receiver, the team could really struggle against the pass, but they could have a top cornerback that is going to shut down your guy, and everyone else around him is going to succeed. So I think there's a lot more work involved when looking at running backs and wide receivers than there are quarterbacks. So that's why I tend to allow myself to go down in the draft order with quarterbacks and go for 2 average guys instead of a top-tier guy.
I agree to the extent that you can, but again, if a Cam Newton or an Aaron Rodgers is still sitting there in round 4, I'm going to have a hard time passing on them, just because I think that's where their value is able to give the return that you're looking for at that position in order to compensate for giving up a little bit of value at a different position.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there is no such thing as a non-draftable player. It's just, in my experience, like, if I want Cam Newton, I know I'm going to have to reach for him in the 2nd or 3rd. If he drops to the 4th, I'm picking him up instantly. But I just know there's always that 1 or 2 guys that will reach for the top guys. It's going to happen with your quarterback. It's going to happen. I was in a draft last night. We had a defense go in the 6th round. We had a kicker go in the 9th round. I mean, people reach all the time. So it just, to me, those top guys just, unless everyone is ready to let them fall a little bit, are just off my radar. But one top guy who should stay on your radar, because he will be falling in drafts and is really curious as far as when you do want to draft him, is Tom Brady. Obviously suspended for the first 4 games, and it kind of throws a wrench into things. When do you pick him up? Who do you pick up behind him to cover for those first 4 games? And again, in the draft that we had a guy who drafted Tom Brady, and he drafted Tony Romo behind him, and our joke was, well, now his season is covered, because now he has Tony Romo for the first 4 games, and then by the time he gets hurt, he's going to have Tom Brady there to finish the season.
Fair enough. I think, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, so where would you take Tom Brady?
I have Tom Brady, just a little foreshadowing here. I have him 9th on my quarterback board, and that is based solely on the fact that he's going to miss the first 4 games. A third of the season is a pretty big impact, but if a Tom Brady's still sitting there in the 7th or 8th round, I'm certainly going to take a strong consideration at picking him up. And the reason why is because just like with a Cam Newton and Aaron Rodgers or a Russell Wilson, once you have Tom Brady in your lineup, you don't have to mess with quarterback anymore. So you could pick a Tom Brady up in one of those late middle rounds, and then plug and play another quarterback, for weeks in order to compensate for not having Brady there. So he'll be interesting. It'll be very interesting to see how far down he does fall, because there's certainly value there. I think personally he's a top 3 quarterback. The only problem is he's not going to start until week 5.
Yeah, and that's the thing to remember is we've been talking about, taking 2 quarterbacks like middle tier, but there's no better middle tier combo than taking a Tom Brady and anyone else. I mean, you can combine him with a Blake Bortles, Tyrod Taylor, Tony Romo, just any of those guys that would be in that 8 to 12 round section. You can use them for 4 rounds, and then you have Tom Brady, who most likely would have been taken in the first 4 or 5 rounds, and then you're pretty set. And to me, listen, I'm a Jets fan, so I've lived through the nightmare that is Tom Brady. Whenever Roger Goodell does this to him or the Patriots, he goes ridiculous. I'm a big fan of the Fantasy Football Podcast on ESPN and Matthew Berry, and he calls this the Gronk U Tour. I am 100% behind that. I mean, you go back with Spygate and all of that, the next year, Tom Brady and Randy Moss just blew up the league and just set records left and right. I could see Tom Brady, after coming back from those first 4 weeks, and lighting things up as well.
Well, I had angry Tom Brady last season, and I ended up winning the championship. So I completely understand the angry Tom Brady aspect of things. And I certainly think that having him as your quarterback for the stretch drive, the middle of the season, is a great idea. And it really comes down to how early do people reach for Tom Brady. If they reach for him in the early rounds, then you don't have to worry about it. But again, if he's sitting there in those late middle rounds, why wouldn't you pick him up? Because you're still going to be able to find one of those other middle tier quarterbacks to fill in for those first 4 weeks.
Yeah, and speaking of that fill in, do you go back to back with Tom Brady and take a Tony Romo or Blake Bortles or somebody like that, somebody that maybe after the first 4 weeks you could trade off once Tom Brady's back? Or do you wait till the last pick of the draft and take a Garoppolo and just run with the Patriots offense?
Well, I think it comes down to doing a little bit of research again. If you go into the research the same way that you would if you're drafting 2 of those middle tier quarterbacks, and you look at the schedule of players in those first 4 weeks, that should give you a lot of insight about who you might tack on to a Tom Brady draft so that you can find somebody who's going to give you the most return for those first 4 weeks. I personally wouldn't take Garoppolo, and that, again, is not only because he's a backup quarterback and an unproven commodity, but also I look at the schedule for New England, and they've got in those first 4 weeks a game at Arizona. Then they also play the Texans and the Bills, which are 2 good offenses, or defenses, I should say, as well. So you've got 2 top 10 defenses and 1 borderline top 10 defense 3 out of the first 4 weeks. So that right there would probably be enough to scare me away from taking a Garoppolo.
Yeah, and I wouldn't sleep on Miami as well, another team that they play in that first 4. I don't think the defense is that solid, but they do create a lot of pressure. And a young quarterback like Garoppolo could find himself in stress mode, if you will. So I'm right there with you. The schedule is way too tough. Even if Garoppolo was the next Tom Brady, it's just tough for him in those 4 weeks to really give you enough points fantasy-wise to make it worth it. I'm with you where I would take somebody in the very next pick and use them for 4 weeks and use them as trade bait. I mean, both of us are huge on the trade market. We like to make moves. Our team is in constant flux if you will. So I like having that trade piece that I can also use for high value while I had them as well.
Well, and not only that, if you take a flyer on one of those middle tier quarterbacks and you pick one up with a ceiling that is kind of untested, then you have an opportunity there to, maybe have a guy who, just in case something happened to Tom Brady, could still carry your team anyway. If you're stuck with as your backup, then if something did happen to Brady, now you have Garoppolo, and you don't have one of those middle tier quarterbacks that might be having a career year per se. So I like having that option of being able to have somebody that, if something did happen to Brady, I can rely on instead of a backup quarterback.
Yeah, and speaking of booming, let's get right into it with our little boom or bust. I want to know your big sleeper and your big bust, and we're fantasy players, so we start very pessimistic. So I need your bust, sir. Who's that guy that's getting drafted just far too high than what you think his expectations should be?
Well, this one might kind of surprise you, but I am not completely sold yet on Kirk Cousins. And even though I think Kirk Cousins is in that middle tier, some people have him ranked as high as 9th, 10th, 11th. I personally have him down around the 16 mark. And again, just to point out to everybody, fantasy football analysis, a lot of it is based on opinions. So that doesn't mean we're going to be right all the time. If you show me a fantasy football player who's always right, I'd like to meet him because I've never met one. But my own opinion is that Kirk Cousins' sample size is too small for me to say he's a guaranteed can't miss top 10 quarterback this season.
I can understand that. My argument against saying Kirk Cousins is a bust, because I'm one of those guys that has him in the 9, 10, 11 range. Yes, his sample size is small, but I think this year he finally has the monkey of Robert Griffin III off his back. He knows this is his team. He spent the whole offseason as the number one. He's not battling for a position. And it kind of showed late in the season when they finally just said, okay, no matter what, this is Cousins' team. The first 6-7 weeks he kind of struggled a little bit, but later on he got things rolling. He had one of, what was it? I saw, I want to say the last 4 or 5 weeks, only 2 quarterbacks had more fantasy points than Kirk Cousins, and I like that. He also led the league in completion percentage and threw for over 4,000 yards. I mean, and he's throwing to guys like Deshaun Jackson, Pierre Garçon, Jameson Crowder. He has Jordan Reed out there. He has a lot of targets out there in Washington as well. And who's running for them? Matt Jones? Do you worry about the running game in Washington? I think they're going to be throwing a lot, and he's going to rack up the fantasy points, in my opinion. But yes, the sample size is small, and that's where my bust comes in, and that's Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod Taylor came out of nowhere. He was the backup in Baltimore. Buffalo picked him up and just ran with him, and he took over the league a little bit, with his big playability over there in Buffalo. But to me, he has 2 moves. He runs with the ball, or he throws it deep to Sammy Watkins. That was it. Now, that really helps in fantasy, because one big bomb to Sammy Watkins, and you're getting a ton of fantasy points, and you can make up a lot of ground in your league. But you can't rely on those 2 moves. I still don't think they have anyone there at Buffalo that's going to support him. I mean, the running game's okay, but not a lot of targets out there, and I just can't see him being somebody that I would want on my team.
And that's where I disagree with you. I think that there's a lot of value in having a quarterback who prefers to run the ball. And when you look at what's one of the primary reasons that Cam Newton is the number 1 rated quarterback in fantasy football? Because he runs. And not only does he run, he scores touchdowns. Now, that might be part of where you could say Tyrod Taylor hasn't established himself as a big touchdown producer yet. But I think he's firmly entrenched now as the number one guy there, with EJ Manuel, no longer necessarily even considered as the starter. And it's time for Tyrod Taylor to take that next step. And with his rushing ability, those rushing yards tally up a lot quicker than passing yards do. So you can't expect Tyrod Taylor to necessarily throw for 4,000 yards and 35 touchdowns this season. But I think 3,500 to 4,000 yards with 6 or 7 rushing touchdowns and 500 yards rushing is a fair estimate for him. And that value there in all those rushing yards is why I have him rated above a guy like a Kirk Cousins.
I just don't see him getting over 4,000 yards passing. I mean, I can understand the rushing yards and the rushing touchdowns, but don't you forget, Kirk Cousins had 5 rushing touchdowns himself. Now, will he repeat that? Probably not. But I do think the arm is there, and I think he's going to improve. So how about we do this? How about I challenge you right here and now, Kirk Cousins versus Tyrod Taylor, end of season fantasy points. I say Kirk Cousins will have more than Tyrod Taylor.
You betcha. It's a challenge.
All right.
I will take that challenge.
It's our first challenge of the year. We'll keep track of this kind of stuff and see which one of us got the most right. It'll be just an interesting way to keep things going. So let's go from the bust and let's go to the sleeper. Who's that guy that is just not getting attention that you think could make a big fantasy impact this season?
My sleeper is a guy that I don't even have in my top 15. However, I could see him possibly cracking the top 10 and certainly top 15, and that is Marcus Mariota. And I base that on the fact that it looks as though they're going to give him a little bit more opportunity to run the ball this season. They're talking about designing some run plays for him specifically, and he's a great open field running quarterback. And again, the value of a running quarterback can't be underestimated because those points tack up the same way that running backs points would. So if you look at last season, he averaged over 7 yards a carry, and that was in a limited season due to injuries. So you've got a guy who's going to be given more opportunity to run with designed running plays, and I like the upside for a guy like him. And not only that, as we mentioned last week, Tennessee was my garbage time team, if you will, of teams that are probably going to be playing from behind a lot. So here's a guy with rushing ability who's going to be trailing for a lot of his games. So they're going to be throwing the ball, and I think Mariota is obviously going to be a major component of second halves and opportunities to put up some points as a quarterback.
Yeah, I'm not hating on that pick. I think that's a decent pick as far as a sleeper goes. I'm not the biggest fan of the talent around him on wide receiver. We'll see how Tajay Sharp does in that role, but I think they're going to be more of a balanced offense at first. But yes, the junk time is crucial. Just look at Jacksonville last year, and that's how I'm looking at it as well, is who's that quarterback who's just going to fill up junk time. And it's actually a guy I drafted as my very last pick of this 14-teamer, just as a flyer, and that's Robert Griffin III. Now, yes, he hasn't really played over the last few years. He's probably nothing like he was his rookie season, but I don't think he has to be. And he's on a team that I don't think is going to perform that well. I don't think they're going to stay in games, but junk time is going to just rack up the fantasy points that you've seen so far in the preseason, which, again, it doesn't really matter that much, the preseason, but it's kind of fun to watch. Yeah, they are liking the deep ball. He is hitting Terrell Pryor with consistency. They're going deep, and that is a great combination for a team that is trailing. And you have a rookie with Corey Coleman there. Again, Terrell Pryor. Josh Gordon comes back after a few games. Let's see if he can contribute or if he gets suspended for the 98th time. But that's a lot of deep threat weapons for him. Again, not much of a rushing game there, and they're going to be trailing a lot. So I like Robert Griffin III a lot for that quarterback that will get you 5 points in the first half and 25 points in the second half?
I can see your logic for the deep passing, especially if Josh Gordon does come back and resembles anywhere close to, say, 75% of the form that he had prior to all of his issues. However, I'm not sold on Griffin necessarily being able to take full advantage of that. Yes, he does throw a good deep ball. He's going to have some opportunities to make some plays, but if you take away his rushing ability, which with his injuries, and I'm sorry, I've watched Robert Griffin and I've pulled for the guy, to be honest, because I loved his first season when he threw 20 touchdowns with only 5 interceptions, which those aren't huge numbers, but the interception numbers was low. But he rushed for 815 yards with 7 touchdowns, which is huge as far as quarterbacks go. But when you get past that first season, he only ran for 1 more touchdown in 22 games. So that's definitely a concern for me. And my other issue with Robert Griffin is I have watched him try to be elusive when he runs. And if there's one guy in the league who just has not figured out how to slide for whatever reason, it's Robert Griffin III. And if he has not learned how to protect his body better, he's going to get killed just like he has in recent years because he just doesn't want to step out of bounds. He doesn't want to slide. It just, everything feels awkward to me when I watch him run. And even though he has some ability to run, it's that end of the run part that really concerns me. And I got to put him high up on my injury list. And because of those concerns and because it's Cleveland, I have a hard time agreeing with you.
Well, he is sliding in preseason. And the other reason I do like Robert Griffin III is, yes, those numbers went down drastically, and yes, he is injury prone, but I think he was just completely misused in Washington. I think he was banged up, and they still just went, no, you just do your thing. You run all over the place. They didn't try to reel him in a little bit. Partially, I think that was due to the giant ego he had coming into the league. And honestly, what better way to knock your ego down 7 pegs than get sent to Cleveland? I think he's a little bit more mature. I think he is understanding his place a bit more. I don't think he thinks he's the greatest thing since sliced bread anymore. And he just wants to go out there and compete and show that he really is a good quarterback. So to me, not only could this be that sleeper fantasy quarterback out there, this could be, the breakout season for Robert Griffin, and people could go, oh yeah, this is why we all liked him in his rookie season. Now, am I going to start him every week? No. But he's just one of those guys to keep your eye on, I think, and see how he performs once the regular season gets going, and see if he is that Blake Bortles of this year that, the Jaguars didn't really compete as much as they would have liked to last year, but Blake Bortles sure was putting up the numbers, and I think Robert Griffin could do the same.
Well, that's one of the beauties of fantasy football. We are all general managers of our own team, and we're all allowed our own opinions, and we certainly don't have to agree with each other because it's our team and we can run it any way we want to, dang it.
Yeah, and the records at the end will let one of us make fun of the others.
That is always the case, and I have bragging rights at least until the end of this season.
All right, so any other quarterback opinions that you would like to share? Or do you want to just go down our rankings real quick?
I think we can hit our top 10 or top 15 and go from there.
All right, so just right off the bat, the three of us agree on the top 3. Cam Newton, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson. You have them as 2nd to 3rd round picks. That's where they're going. I wouldn't take them till the 3rd or 4th, again, because I want to worry more about the running back and wide receiver positions. And then this is where we disagree a little bit. You're big on Carson Palmer. Tell me why.
I'm big on Carson Palmer because he has possibly the best weapons in the NFL across the board. He's got a great receiving running back in Johnson. He's got 3 wide receivers that are phenomenal, and all of them are capable of producing big plays in John Brown, Michael Floyd, and of course the veteran Larry Fitzgerald. And with those weapons in place, I think Carson Palmer is poised for another big season. I temper that just a little bit because of his injury history. But if Carson Palmer's on the field, he's going to put up top 5 numbers, in my opinion.
Yeah, he's definitely great. And as you said, the weapons around him are phenomenal. I have him 6th in my rankings, but my 4, 5, and 6 were very close and tough to decide. I lean to put him in the bottom of those 3 just for the fact that I think they're going to be winning a lot of games and running the ball a lot more near the end. I think they have the more balanced offense, so that's why I knocked him down a little bit. But the weapons around him and his arm and his ability is amazing. But my number 4 is Drew Brees. Great ability as well. Maybe not as great a weapons around him, but I don't see them competing that much, which will then allow Drew Brees to air it out. They do like to throw the ball a ton. Oh, excuse me as my mic falls. They like to throw the ball a ton anyways, so I think that brings it up. And I just see Drew Brees going off this year. They've struggled a little bit. There's been a lot of talks of needing to split him and Sean Payton up, like this is the end of the era. And something just tells me that he's going to want to go out there and shut up the critics.
I've got Drew Brees at 5, so I can't argue with you much. I definitely have him in the top 5. And the thing about Drew Brees that I really love is just his consistency. If there's a guy in the league who has been a consistent fantasy starter and has been able to produce at a high level, almost season in, season out, you look at Drew Brees' numbers, and since 2008, his lowest touchdown total was 32. It's really hard to argue with that kind of production. And he's thrown for over 4,000 yards every season since 2006, including 3 times throwing for over 5,000 yards. So you're talking about a guy who could finish anywhere in the top 5, to be honest. I have him at 5 only because I agree with you as far as his weapons being a little bit limited in comparison to, say, Arizona. But you would certainly not find a more consistent value at quarterback than Drew Brees. And if he's sitting there in those middle to later rounds, I'm going to have a hard time passing that kind of consistency up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other guy that we have in that second 3 is Andrew Luck, coming off the injury. Has always been known as the up-and-coming, the next prodigy quarterback in the league. Definitely got knocked down a few pegs after last season. I don't like a lot of the weapons around him. T.Y. Hilton is good. But I do like the fact that they spent the entire offseason working on that offensive line, trying to protect him, trying to give him more time to keep him healthy. So I still think he is a very valuable quarterback, but again, not that thrilled about the weapons around him.
And I have Andrew Luck sitting at the 5 spot, or at the 6 spot myself. And a lot of that is based on, you look at his 4 seasons as a quarterback, and we'll kind of throw out last season. He played 7 games, threw 15 touchdown passes. But his first 2 seasons, he had 23 touchdowns and 18 interceptions. The second season, 23 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. The third season was an explosive season, obviously, where he had 40 touchdowns. He did have 16 interceptions, but he threw for over 4,700 yards. But that's just that one season, and I'm not 100% convinced that we can be sure that we're going to see another season like that. I do still have him at 6 because I do think that the potential is certainly there. But to me, he's a little bit overhyped because I haven't seen enough out of him to say, yeah, he's definitely a guy that's going to be a surefire top 5 quarterback. So I have him just outside of my top 5. I expect him to produce well, but because of those reasons I listed, I'm not 100% sold.
Yeah, and then 7 and 8 and 9 we all agree with. Eli Manning, Ben Roethlisberger, and Tom Brady. And I'll just hit on Eli Manning for a minute. He was one that I tempted to move up even higher, but just couldn't find the argument to put him ahead of a Carson Palmer or Andrew Luck or Drew Brees. But I love the weapons around him. I mean, Odell Beckham Jr. is amazing. We'll see if Victor Cruz can finally get back on the field and show why he was one of the top receivers before. And I love Sterling Shepard. I think he's going to be the breakout rookie wide receiver, of the league. So 3 amazing weapons out there if they can all stay healthy. And they love to throw the ball over there in New York. So I wanted to put him in my top 5 as kind of that big sleeper pick, but I just couldn't find that argument.
I also have him ranked in the same place you do, and I know that this probably goes up against a lot of the more conventional analysts. We both have him at 7, and I'm right there with you for the same reasons. I love the weapons that he has too. Odell Beckham is the best or second best wide receiver in the league, in my opinion. Antonio Brown and him, you can flip-flop him. You probably won't go wrong either way. And with what he did last season, he threw for 35 touchdowns, 4,400 yards, and the team should only get better. I'm not convinced that Victor Cruz will ever be healthy, but if he did come back, that would certainly help him. But Sterling Shepard has a great upside. I agree with you there. And with someone else there that can take a little bit of the burden off of Odell Beckham, the potential is very high there. And the Giants definitely love to throw the ball. The last 2 seasons alone, Eli Manning's had over 600 pass attempts. So when you're throwing the ball that frequently, you can expect good numbers if just by volume alone. I do have a little bit of concern with Eli Manning's interception rates. Mm-hmm. He's thrown double-digit interceptions every year since 2005. So you have to temper it a little bit. He's going to lay an egg from time to time, and some of those eggs could be one of those 1 touchdown and 4 interception kind of games, which could hurt you. But I think there's certainly some potential for him to have one of his best seasons of his career.
I'm with you. So I'll just throw this out here. League leader last year was 36 touchdown passes by Tom Brady. Eli was 1 off. Over or under 40 touchdowns for Eli Manning this season?
I'm going to take just under. I have him right around, say, 38. I do think he's going to be a little bit higher than his 35 of last season. I'm not 100% sure that he'll be able to throw for 40. But part of that could come down to how good is that defense and how much garbage time can Eli get. But the reason I have that tempered a little bit is of those 35 touchdowns that he threw last season, one of those games he had 6 touchdown passes, which was a phenomenal game between him and Drew Brees, where it was just basically touchdown answered by touchdown, just one of the most wild games in NFL history. Mm-hmm. So if you throw that game out, he threw for 29 touchdowns in 15 games, which is still pretty respectable, but I'm not quite sure he'll throw for 40.
Would you like to challenge that?
You betcha.
All right, there we go.
I will take the under. I will take the under 40.
I will take 40 and above for Eli. I just think he's going to throw a lot of touchdowns. The reason why I couldn't put him over the top 5 is, like you said, the interception rate's a little high for me. I do think the team's going to improve as well. But I think anytime they're near the end zone, they're going to want to throw the ball. Those targets are too good. Just throw it up and let them get it. So I think most of the time they're in the red zone, you're going to see the Giants throwing the ball. So I think the touchdown rate will go up. You had Big Ben at 8 and told me get ready for a rant. So I will step back from the mic and let you rant, sir.
All right. As most of you who listened to last week's show know, I am a Steeler fan. However, that does not mean that I'm not a critic of my favorite team. I'm probably one of their harsher critics because I'm also a realist. For those of you who have seen Big Ben ranked anywhere from, say, 5th to 9th, they're basing that off of the potential that Antonio Brown obviously brings them, that Guys like Marcus Wheaton will step up. Ladarius Green is a more athletic tight end. And Le'Veon Bell is one of the best receiving running backs in the league. Well, Le'Veon Bell's suspension did get reduced one game. It's down to 3 now. So that will help a little bit. But if you look at Big Ben's career, his highest touchdown total, he did it twice, was 32 touchdowns. And those are the only 2 seasons he's ever thrown for more than 30 touchdowns in a season. If you couple that with the fact that last season he missed 4 games, and Le'Veon Bell's not there, Martavis Bryant is suspended for the season, Antonio Brown is still the go-to guy. You've got Ladarius Green on the shelf, and there's no clear timetable on to when he's going to return. D'Angelo Williams is a decent receiving back, but he's not phenomenal by any stretch. I'm just not convinced that Ben Roethlisberger is going to be able to exceed that 32 touchdown plateau that he's reached in the past. And I'm not sold on that team even wanting to throw the ball nearly as much as people think they will because they have a D'Angelo Williams and a Le'Veon Bell. I think they're still going to be leaning towards a more balanced offense with that kind of a rushing attack.
Yeah, I can see it. And I ranked Big Ben 8th as well, so I can't really sit here and disagree with you. Let's just go through the rest of these top 15 real quick and just kind of let you get a quick hit on one of them. We basically agreed that Tony Romo is 10, and then other than the Kirk Cousins and Tyrod Taylor, which we both had at 11 respectively, the last 4 that we have on this are basically interchangeable in Blake Bortles, Phillip Rivers, Stafford, and Derek Carr. Just give me a quick hit on one of these guys.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a quick hit on Matthew Stafford. I know Megatron's gone, and that's obviously a big hit. How can it not be a hit? But the thing is I like the tools that he's replaced them with. You know, you've got Marvin Jones has come over and given them a little bit more depth there. He has Theo Riddick, who's one of the best receiving running backs in the league. So when you factor in a guy like a Theo Riddick, you can't undervalue that. We've seen Darren Sproles be one of the best receiving running backs in the league for a long time. And he's kind of one of those guys that stays off the radar until he breaks out for 150 scrimmage yards and 2 touchdowns. And Theo Riddick is a guy who has that same potential. And I don't see Detroit being ahead in a lot of games because I'm still not sold on that defense. So I think they're going to have to throw the ball a lot. And Amir Abdullah is an unproven commodity at running back. He's got a lot of potential. Everyone seems to think that he's got the possibility to be a top 10 running back one day, but we haven't seen it yet. So because I think Detroit's going to throw the ball a lot, I like Matthew Stafford to have a potential top 10 season. But I have him listed at 13. But it's one of those, you never know what he could do kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'll just quickly hit on Blake Bortles. Anyone that listens to the Football to the Max podcast knows I am very high on the Jaguars this year. I think they're going to win the AFC South. I think the defense is much improved. The offense is more balanced and all of that. However, as far as fantasy is concerned, I do think Blake Bortles is going to take a hit because of the fact that they're going to be in more games. They're going to be more competitive. The junk time goes away. And on top of that, with Chris Ivory now in the mix, the running game is now more prevalent. Yeldon is a great running back, but he was also great out of the backfield to catch the ball, so they kind of used him more in that fashion. Chris Ivory is awful out of the backfield as a receiver, so he's just there to run the ball. And I think it's going to make that offense a bit more balanced, which is going to make the team better. But as far as Blake Bortles' fantasy production goes, I do think that will take a hit.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you on Bortles for those same reasons. And, you know, having a Chris Ivory gives them a little bit more of a red zone threat, too, as far as running the ball. And that's obviously going to take away from some of the passing touchdowns. But you have to keep in mind, too, that you've got Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns there, plus Julius Thomas at tight end. So the weapons are still there. but the manner in which they are used is probably going to be reduced a little bit because of the running game having more balance and obviously the defense supposed to be improved.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to those defenses. Just really quickly here as we're kind of winding this podcast down. We talked a little bit on our first podcast about the two defenses versus one defense draft approach. And my question to you is, where are you taking those two? Are you looking at just taking two randomly, or not randomly, obviously, but taking two as your two of your last three picks? Or are you reaching for one? Or what are you doing when you take two defenses?
I am in the same boat as you as far as reaching for a defense. I cannot find any reason to reach for a defense inside of the first 10 rounds. It goes completely against everything I believe. And that's because I know that there's something that I find more important. And I try to dig for those defenses that might be flying a little bit under the radar. And if I see two of the defenses that I have listed, say, in my top 12 still available to me in those late rounds 14, 15, 16, and I've got a couple sleepers still sitting on the board that I think will still be there even if I pick a defense, then I think I'll probably go ahead and pick up one or two defenses that I feel pretty good about. I don't mind taking two defenses in a draft if I have a suspicion that defense A and defense B, either one could be a top 5 defense, because I'd rather have them in advance instead of have them break out big early on, and if I'm in a bad position on the waiver wire, I won't have a chance to pick them up. So it's one of those things. It comes down to draft flow, as we mentioned earlier in the show, and if I see a couple of teams that I feel pretty highly on still there in those late rounds, then I would certainly consider picking two defenses in a row there. Or one defense that probably should have got more credit and isn't and slips down into those late rounds. That might be one of those situations where I have a team at a top 5 defense, and if I can secure one of those in a late round, then I might only take one defense.
Yeah, and I get it. And I usually carry two defenses throughout the season and kind of play the matchups. But I like to take a flyer near the end. Again, in the draft I did last night, I took the big flyer on RG3 instead of a second defense. So I get drafting two defenses, but usually I like to run with one for a week or two and then kind of see how the season is flowing. My next question to you, however, is how much does the division factor into how you see a defense? Could two defenses be on the same level, but one be on a tough division and one be in a pretty weak division, change which team you're going to pick?
I think it has to. You base your drafting of a defense on two things, really. One is, are they a dominant collection of players? For example, a Seattle or a Carolina that you really feel is going to have a great defense regardless of who they're playing. But once you get past those couple of elite defenses, then you kind of have to pick and choose who you're going to take at the defensive spot. So as we stated earlier, we carry two defenses because we like to decide based on matchups. You know, if a quarterback is terrible on a team that your defense is going to play against, by all means, that's the defense you're going to start. So if you've got a defense who's playing 2 or 4 games, since division games are obviously 2 games head-to-head, that's a big chunk of your season right there where you can start a defense with confidence against an offense that really struggles. So by all means, a weak division should certainly affect the draft stock that you give to a defense.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I remember years a team like when Seattle was first becoming that great dominant defense, it was really easy for them because all 3 of their teams in that division were awful. Arizona has since much improved, but they still get St. Louis twice and San Francisco twice, and those are just juicy matchups that you just want to go after. So let's just kind of go through these rankings because, again, defenses aren't super important as far as draft goes. They're one of those that later on in the season you pay more attention to. But we had the same two, but we flip-flopped them. I have Carolina 1 and Seattle 2, and you have the opposite. Why do you like Seattle more?
I like Seattle more because of the reasons that we just discussed. They have 2 games against Jared Goff, and they have 2 games against either whoever ends up winning the job in San Francisco. So there's 4 games right off the top against quarterbacks who are completely questionable. And obviously they play Arizona 2 games, which could hurt that defense a little bit. But I love him 4 games against the Rams quarterback and San Francisco's quarterbacks. So for me, that one kind of comes down to scheduling. If the team's defenses are relatively equal coming out, I love those 4 divisional games against quarterbacks who are either borderline awful or rookies.
Yeah, I'm with you, and I think their schedule is a little bit easier. But I think the talent in Carolina is just too good. Yes, they lose Norman, and that's going to take them back a little bit. But just the pressure that they go and the speed that defense runs in, I'm all for them, especially I think they're going to create more turnovers than Seattle and maybe even create them into touchdowns as well, which really bolsters the point total. I get Seattle's weak schedule, especially in those 4 games, but I think age is starting to get to them. Finally, the NFL loves parity, and I think parity is starting to catch up with Seattle just a little bit. It's tough to have that dominant of a defense for as long as they have. They've done a wonderful job with it, but I think you can start to see a little bit of the cracks showing up. That's why I have them down in second. It's not like they're falling apart or anything. I have Houston 3. You have them down in 5th, and I can honestly kind of understand why, as far as I think there's a lot of good offenses in that division. Was there another reason why you dropped them down to 5th?
Well, I dropped them down to 5th just because I thought Cincinnati and Denver's defenses would be better, to be honest. And I base some of that on the fact that I don't think Denver has dropped off defensively as much as some of the fantasy football pundits seem to think that they have. Granted, part of my logic for having Houston at 5 could also be applied to the Broncos, and that's because we don't know what we're going to get out of an Osweiler as far as quarterback situation is. So if you have a quarterback who is potentially turning the ball over frequently, defenses are going to give up more points just based on field position alone. And Osweiler is an unproven commodity. And I saw what happened to that Houston defense the first half of last season, and they were awful, to be honest. And they were great the second half. I actually picked them up on waivers and played them the rest of the season in the second half last year. But they were possibly the worst defense in the league for nearly a whole half of last season. So I tempered the expectations just a little bit because I want to see which defense is going to show up. The Dr. Jekyll that we saw at the second half of last season, or the Mr. Hyde that was for the first half of the season when that defense, which was actually drafted in our league, got dropped. And then I later picked them up when they were the good Houston. So we'll see what happens with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you, as you said, you had Cincinnati 3. I have them 5th. I think they're a great defense. I drop them a little bit just because, again, I think people are sleeping on the junk time ability of Cleveland. I do think Baltimore has improved, and Pittsburgh is going to put up points. So the schedule for Cincinnati is a little tough, but I do like that defense. But I want to get into the big disparity that we have on our rankings. We've already brought up Denver and why you like them. You have them 4th on our rankings. I have Kansas City 4th and Denver all the way down in 8th. For kind of the same reasons you said about Houston. Listen, the defense is good. I don't think it's completely dropped off, but that offense could put them in some really awful situations with Mark Sanchez as their quarterback. And I really think you're going to see a lot of times where you're losing points basically because Sanchez has turned the ball over so much that they're just giving up points by default.
certainly a fair point. It's the same argument I just made for Houston. That's part of what we love about fantasy football. Can Mark Sanchez protect the ball even reasonably well? My guess is I think Denver is going to lean on their running game a little bit more this season and take a little bit of the burden off of Mark Sanchez. And I just think Denver has most of their pieces back that they had last season. And Von Miller's been paid. He's happy, and he's Von Miller. And you could obviously make the same argument for a team like Houston and say, well, J.J. Watt. But as far as comparing Denver to Kansas City, I just think Denver's defense is capable of making a bigger impact. And let's not forget, playing at Mile High Stadium is a lot more difficult than teams want to think it is. That altitude really does have an effect on teams. And there's even players out there with, say, the sickle cell disease that can't even play there because of the altitude. So I find teams getting winded a little bit quicker in Denver, and I just really feel in my gut that Denver's talent level is a little higher than Kansas City's.
Well, why do you have Kansas City so low?
Well, I mean, seventh isn't necessarily completely low, but let's face it. You've got
low, Mike. It's so no.
it is kind of low compared to your fourth. I would agree with you there. But what's going on with their linebacker situation? You've got Justin Houston and Tomball Lee. We don't know what their health situation is. Eric Berry has been having some issues again. They still have, Marcus Peters, but Sean Smith is gone now. The one thing I will give you an edge on is special teams. I think the rookie Tyreek Hill has the potential to make some plays on special teams, and Denver is still kind of on a let's see what develops in the preseason approach to their special teams. So I could give you a little bit of a nod there, but I'm not sold on Kansas City being healthy going into the season. And even if those defense are at an equal level, say after week 5, what's going to happen in those first 4 weeks? That's my question mark for them.
Yeah, I get it. And listen, I think Kansas City does have their questions, but they get answered by the fact that offense loves to control the ball, so they can kind of cover up any injuries that they have on defense a little bit, fantasy-wise, at least. And for the fact that when they do play Denver, they will play Mark Sanchez, and he will turn the ball over to them as well. So I just have to throw it out there. Would you accept my challenge, sir? Kansas City's defense all season versus Denver's defense.
You betcha. Let's do it.
All right.
I'll take Denver versus KC.
Hey, we got 3 challenges here on just the second episode of Fantasy Football. Some other defenses to note real quick. Anything else jump off the page for you?
Well, we briefly covered Cincinnati. I have them at 3, and I base that on the fact that they're returning most of the pieces they had last season, and they were a great defense last season. Obviously, you have some issues with them keeping their heads on straight, as seen in the wild card game last season. But I have to think that after them completely blowing the game against Pittsburgh, which Pittsburgh blew it to them and Cincinnati said, no, you take it, I have to think those guys are going to be aware of what happened last year, and they're going to want to come out and prove something. So I've got Cincinnati at 3 in my mind, just because I expect grown men to do better. So Cincinnati, it's up to you to prove me right.
Yeah, I'm always worried about Cincinnati. Yes, they want to come out and prove themselves right, but they just keep going out and showing that they're knuckleheads on defense, so I can't trust them at all to keep their head on straight and try to focus and show, no, this is who we really are. I think we've seen who you really are, and I'm more worried about suspensions and anything else there. The one team I'll bring up is a homer pick, I guess, is my New York Jets. I do absolutely love that defense. They're going to bring so much pressure up the middle. Their defensive line is one of the best in the league. Darrelle Revis still has it. I wouldn't say he's a one of the top 3 cornerbacks in the league, but he still is a very good cornerback. And again, I like to balance my defense with an offense that controls the ball. And Ryan Fitzpatrick doesn't turn the ball over that much. I think they want to run the ball and win that time of possession, which helps in fantasy football as less points will be scored in the game. The thing that I do hesitate with is their schedule that first 7 weeks is absolutely brutal. And, I mean, you could easily say they could lose 5 of those first 7, and that will not help defensive numbers at all. So I hesitate with the schedule, but I love the talent on that team.
I can't argue with the talent. I have the Jets at 8. I know you have them at 6. And I have it at 8 for the reason you just mentioned. The teams they're playing in those first 7 weeks, plus they get Tom Brady twice. They get Andrew Luck later in the season. You know, you've got Andy Dalton and Carson Palmer, Russell Wilson, Joe Flacco, Ben Roethlisberger. Those are all quarterbacks that can put up some points. So because of that really difficult schedule, I think that's why I have to knock the Jets down just a notch. But I like their defensive line too. You know, you didn't really talk too much about that defensive line, but Wilkerson, Richardson, and Williams are solid up front. So they definitely have the pieces in place. It's just they're playing against such a high level of quarterbacks that I have to temper expectations just a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. So let's move off of defenses and let's get to kickers. Okay, that was it. Now, do you want to talk about kickers? The only thing with kickers to me is I laugh when anyone takes them outside of, I'll say the last 2 picks. I can get it the second to last pick just to get it out of the way or whatever. But if anyone reaches for a kicker, isn't that just the comedy of the draft?
I am completely inclined to agree with you, and I've looked at some of the ADPs for kickers, and I have seen guys like Steven Gostkowski, for example, going in round 8, 9, 10, which Steven Gostkowski is a great kicker. I don't disagree there. New England has a great offense, and that's all good and well, but he's a kicker. And here's the thing. Even if Gostkowski scores 10, 15 more points, which is usually a fair spread between kickers, say 1 through 6, that isn't enough value for me to go out and draft a kicker in the 9th round. And if you aren't picking your kicker in the last round, maybe if you've got a Gostkowski or a Hauschka, maybe a Vinatieri or something like that, in the second to last round, and you're picking back-to-back, then okay, you took him in 1 round earlier. But other than that, you should be looking for kickers who play for prolific offenses and kickers that play for teams that are really good moving the ball between the 20s, guys that are fairly consistent, or guys with a big leg. And outside of that, there's nothing else to think about as far as kickers are concerned. And in 99% of cases, they should be taken with your last pick in your draft.
Yeah, absolutely. I look for guys like a Blair Walsh in Minnesota, Robbie Gould in Chicago, Cairo Santos in Kansas City. Again, those guys that they're going to put up points, but a lot of times they're going to get stifled and settle for field goals as well. And they can also kick it a long ways. Brian McManus for Denver, not terrible. Obviously, low altitude. Again, he can kick it a lot farther. But yes, the last pick, maybe second last pick, if you just want to get it over with. Nothing before that. No kicker is worth it at all. I'm looking at last year's stats, and there are, a 19-point differential between the top 5. That's a little over a point a game. You go down another 5, and the differential was 4 points. So, I mean, it's not worth it, and you can never know. I mean, Mason Crosby was one of those kickers that everyone thought was going to be big. He's on the Green Bay Green Bay team. They're going to put up a lot of points, so the kicker's going to get a lot of points, right? Nope, outside the top 10. So you never know. It's pointless as far as drafts goes to ever worry about what kicker you are going to get. And with that, I think that's going to end this episode. On Thursday, we break down everything else, and it's going to be jam-packed with information and everything else as we do running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends all in one podcast for you. Mike, how in the world are we going to do this?
It's going to take a while, but I think it's going to be one of those things where people are going to certainly find a lot of quality information. And the whole purpose for cramming all of this information in this week is so that you guys will have this ready for use for any drafts that you might be doing this coming weekends. We have a reason for why we're getting all this stuff done this week, so we can help out our listeners with having more information to be armed with when they take their GM talents into their own drafts.
So if you have any questions for us about running backs, wide receivers, or tight ends, leave them in the comments on the Facebook page, in the Spreaker, iTunes, wherever you're listening to this podcast. We thank you very much for joining us. Let us know anything that you would like to have us ramble about. If you want to know our opinions on anything, please let us know. But until Thursday, for Mike Mitchell, I am Randy Isbell, and we will see you on the next episode.